Today on The Big Story, the income gap in Singapore falls to its narrowest since 2001. 2 passengers from the cruise line in Japan have died, sparking widespread criticism. Plus, find out how businesses are coping with the coronavirus outbreak. Good evening, you're watching The Big Story, where we discuss the hottest topics of the day. I'm Olivia Quay, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Now, income inequality here fell to its narrowest in almost 2 decades after income for the bulk of households rose by up to 5.6%, while those in 90th to 100th percentile saw their incomes grow by just 0.4%. Income inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient from 0 to 1, with 0 being most equal. And according to the key household income trend survey released this afternoon, the Gini coefficient fell to 0.452 last year, the lowest since 2001. Government transfers and taxes reduced it further to 0.398. And to help us make sense of the findings, I'm joined by Correspondent Yuen Sin. So Yuen Sin, households in the 1st to 90th percentile income group saw real income growth of 3.5 to 5.6%, but those in the top 10% saw theirs increase by just 0.4%. So the difference in income between those two groups has narrowed. But what factors contributed to this?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of long-term structural changes as well as a weakening economy. So you can look at it from two aspects. Over the past decade, right, the income of the bottom 10% income group has actually grown by 43 to 50%, whereas
Wow.
the income for those in the top 50% has dropped by 30 to 43%. And so on one hand, you have one group that has seen a wage increase, and on the other part, they seem to have been more affected by a slowing economy. And experts have also flagged that, because this group of high income earners, right, they could be people like PMETs or people in administrative and managerial positions, right? And this group is more vulnerable to being affected, when there's an economic downturn, for instance. And the wage increase for this group has also been slower than that for the low income group, where, we've seen some progress in government schemes such as the progressive wage model, which does set a minimum wage that floor that these people must meet. Whereas if you look at the group of PMETs, for instance, there isn't really such a protection for this group.
Right. So the Gini coefficient fell from 0.458 in 2018 to, like I said earlier, 0.452 last year. That's a difference of 0.006. So would you consider this significant or insignificant?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you just look at it on a year-on-year basis, it may not be seen as such a huge difference because, it's just a small percentage of the overall figure. But if you look at the trends over the past decade, right, I think the Gini hit a high of 0.477 something in 2007, right? And over the past decade, this figure has been going down. So if you look at the broader trends, you can say that there has been some significant progress in addressing, inequality, for instance. But I think more also needs to be done to figure out if this is something that is actually good for Singapore in the long haul, in the sense that this trend over the past 10 years could also be due to us experiencing slower economic growth.
I see. Well, right now, many sectors are suffering from the coronavirus outbreak and the situation remains uncertain. We don't know when the economy will pick up. So do you think the income gap will widen again this year?
Yes, Olivia, yeah, I agree with you that, it's really hard to tell at this point whether this trend will continue because of, the shocks to the economy that have happened because of this virus. And also, if you look at sectors where it have been hit the hardest, right, like the services and restaurants, this is where you will see a large proportion of low-wage workers as well. So even though they have seen wage increases over the past 10 years, if people get retrenched or, if businesses have to close, and that's where you would see that the income trends may not continue to maintain at the rate that they are right now. Yeah.
Well, did any of the other survey findings surprise you today?
Yeah, so one thing that was interesting is that the overall household income growth, it sloped from 2.6% to 1% this year, right? But actually, if you look at the household per capita income, it hasn't like dropped by that much. I think in fact it has increased from 3% in 2018 to around 4%. So I think that we asked about this at the briefing today, and what they explained was that, well, because household sizes have also dropped over time, right? So even though the overall income that households may be earning has slowed in terms of its increase, because you have less people in one household, there's less people that you need to provide for. So it's better to look at the per capita measure if you want to assess whether there's been change in this aspect.
Right. Well, thanks so much for your insight, Yuen Sin. It was reported today that income inequality in Singapore dropped to its lowest in 2 decades. Singapore families also earned more from work per person last year, and you can read all about it at straitstimes.com. Also making headlines, 5 Singaporeans are quarantined on board the beleaguered Diamond Princess cruise ship in Japan. They are said to be well, but the conditions on the coronavirus hit ship has worsened with more infections, and to this. The liner, which has been quarantined since February 3rd, has reported that more than 620 passengers out of an initial 3,700 have been infected. It's believed that the 2 new fatalities were a Japanese man and woman. Both were in their 80s and believed to have had underlying health issues. Public criticism has increased as Japan acknowledged it has well over half of the known cases outside of China. This comes just months before the Tokyo Olympics starts in July. Questions have been asked why disembarked Japanese passengers didn't spend a further 2 weeks in quarantine, unlike the Australian, American and Hong Kong passengers who returned home. Meanwhile, China has altered the diagnosis criteria for confirming cases for a second time, leading to confusion over the methodology used. Hubei province said today that it had just 349 additional confirmed cases compared with almost 1,700 new cases the previous day. No explanation was given for the sudden decline, but it came a day after new national guidelines advised the province to only report 2 numbers in its overall count: confirmed and suspected cases, in line with how other provincial and national figures are reported. To talk more about China's methodology change, I'm joined by China correspondent Elizabeth Law. So Liz, help us clarify something first. What method was Hubei province using before, and how is it different now?
Right. So I think first we need to go back to how they were, the methodology that they were using in the very first place. In the very beginning, you could only be tested for the virus only if you had pneumonia, which means that only the very, very serious cases were now getting tested, which is why at the time the mortality rate seemed quite high, because they were only reflecting basically the most serious of cases. So that was the beginning where you had to use basically through lab tests. Now that was one. Then last week they changed it a little bit, and they said that because there was a lack of test kits and hospitals were being overwhelmed. So basically in Hubei province, now you could be diagnosed with COVID-19 basically if either you had a lab test or if you exhibited symptoms and you do have a history of contact with other confirmed cases, or and you have a chest X-ray that shows lesions in your lungs, because that is a sign of the virus having taken hold there. Then it shows up in these patches, you see. So that was the way last week. You didn't exactly have to be tested in the lab. All you have to do was that you exhibited symptoms, and then this is backed up by a chest X-ray. Now, so that was only for Hubei province, which is the most hard hit, and also hospitals were overwhelmed. I remember we talked about this last week because we said that this is better because it helps to reflect this on a larger scale, and basically the number of patients that you can diagnose every day is not limited by the capacity of your labs. But come today, which is where we are now, there were new guidelines that were issued yesterday saying that, look, this is really not the most accurate way. So let's go back to the original testing method, which is that the original calculation method, which means that your samples have to be tested at a lab, and then there has to be a positive return that you do have the virus, and then you will be counted as a coronavirus case. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you for clarifying things for us. But do you think, I guess, the second change was even necessary?
Well, yes. So I was in a briefing earlier today with an infectious disease expert, Dr. David Heyman, who actually said that this makes it more accurate because initially at this between in the second that when they had to change last week. So in the last 1 week or so, the numbers have really spiked quite drastically, and that is because they were not only getting patients who had COVID-19, but they were now this dragnet was bringing in patients that also had just regular pneumonia because the symptoms are kind of similar to what you get during COVID. You have respiratory tract infection, you have these lesions in your lungs, but often it is just regular viral pneumonia.
Right. Well, China is now seeing 3 straight days of declining infections. What does this mean? Does it mean that the virus has reached its peak?
I think I would be very, very careful, and doctors are very careful of saying that as well, because in China, it is true that in local media, a lot of them are trying to keep spirits up by saying that, hey, the virus has reached a crest, we are nearly there. But really, I would be careful of saying that what this definitely shows is that all the containment methods are working in places outside of Hubei, but whether or not the virus has reached its peak is hard to say. Also, what the WHO uses as a guideline on how you can tell whether or not an outbreak is over is basically no new infection, basically 2 weeks since the last known infection, and then they wait another 2 weeks more.
Well,
So
under
basically, yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, so basically, for instance, if the last reported infection in Singapore was yesterday, and for the next 2 weeks, which is the incubation period of the virus, we don't have any more new cases, and then another 2 more weeks after that, there are still no new cases. That is how they can say, okay, the outbreak in this country is over.
Right. Well, under the new guidelines issued yesterday, China also emphasized the use of traditional Chinese medicine alongside Western medicine. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so China is trying to have a more holistic approach, not just using Western medication. They are saying that, look, we can use TCM in our treatments as well. And in the set of guidelines, they actually do have 2 recipes on these brews that they say would help alleviate the symptoms. So what they do have, like in one of them, I'm just looking at it on the computer now. Well, it's meant to expel the toxins from your body, and it's to improve your lung function. On the list of ingredients, you have things like ginger, you have shigao, which is plaster, and you have several other Chinese herbs. So it offers a more holistic approach, and as people always say, I mean, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, is not something that has any negative effects. So if there is the option, why not use it? It's if nothing else, at least it just gives you more hydration.
Right. Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Liz. I've been speaking to China correspondent for the Straits Times, Elizabeth Law. Well, back home, immigration officers have issued 77 stay-home notices as of noon today, 12 hours after the new scheme kicked in. These notices were issued to Singapore residents, long-term pass holders and foreign workers who have travelled to mainland China in the last 14 days. Travellers from Hubei province are excluded from this scheme as they are quarantined. The number of coronavirus cases here has grown to 84, with 3 new cases confirmed yesterday. One of the new cases is linked to the Grace Assembly of God cluster. The other case is linked to the Life Church and Missions cluster. Meanwhile, contact tracing is underway on the 3rd case. Of the 84 patients here, 34 have recovered, 4 though are in critical condition. And with Singapore into its 2nd week of DORSCON Orange, workers and business leaders who took measures to ensure the continuity of the operations are beginning to wonder just how long this might continue. Many firms have activated their business continuity plans, or BCPs, since the disease outbreak response level was raised on February 7th. Working from home or working from another site or divided into separate teams, perhaps you're experiencing that right now. For instance, many of the major banks, including UOB and OCBC, have already split staff involved in the critical functions and services into separate teams. A spokesman for the Public Service Division said yesterday that some government agencies have adopted BCPs for critical functions, while other agencies have arranged for teams to work in different offices. With most staff holed up at home and striving to stay connected through online messaging and teleconferencing services, business leaders are starting to count the cost in terms of lost productivity and business. Let's check in with Correspondent Yip Wai Yee on the progress some businesses are making in implementing their BCPs. So Wai Yee, first of all, tell us more about these plans. What changes have companies here adopted?
Okay, so for example, BCPs for some companies means splitting teams. For example, for me and you at ST as well, we have split teams. You're working from the office and I'm at home. And for other teams, I think for other offices, what they do is they get people to work from two different offices, so two different work sites. Or there's also the option of things like staggered work timings. So maybe someone can take the morning shift and then another person in the team can take the evening shift. It's so to reduce cross-contamination risks.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what has it been like for companies to transition from their regular operations to activating their BCPs? What were some initial reactions, for example?
Okay, I think the good thing is from what we've gathered so far, it seems like quite a lot of companies have been pretty quick on activating their BCPs, and it seems like they've already had that in place to prepare for situations such as this. So, pretty much as soon as the alert level was raised to orange, quite a lot of people responded very quickly. So, a lot of the major banks here have activated BCPs and have split teams for critical functions and services. And then there's even a lot of SMEs that we spoke to, despite being small teams, they've somehow managed to either staggered work timings or they've arranged other arrangements in place.
But I guess in the implementation, what are some of the common challenges that these companies have told you about?
Okay, so the thing about, for some colleagues who work from home, I think it's really hard to check whether they're by their computers at all times or whether they're responding to emails all the time. I think there is the problem of productivity. And also, there was some companies I spoke to who have technical issues. So suddenly, when everyone's working remotely, maybe it tests their systems quite a bit. So, for example, there was one marketing communications company I spoke to, and usually what they do when they look at large video files is they just go to a single person's computer to look at it. But now, because they have to download and share these huge files, it's very, very slow and inefficient for them. So there have been some technical glitches, I think, for some people.
Right. Well, Wai Yee, some experts have said that the outbreak could drag on for several more months, perhaps until the warmer weather returns. But really, we don't know when or if the virus could be eradicated. So actually, how sustainable are these BCPs, like split team operations?
Okay, so a lot of the human resource experts we spoke to say that it is sustainable only if companies are willing to, keep on their toes and adapt as and when necessary. So because the virus situation is evolving every single day, so things are different all the time. They have to be willing to change things and perhaps even adjust expectations and target operating models. And for other companies, I think they might have to be okay with accepting that they have to incur extra financial costs. So, for example, for some companies, they have to upgrade teleconferencing tools or upgrading the network security or even hiring freelancers to help with some of the tasks.
Well, let's look ahead now. What conditions would allow for a return to a more normal mode of operations, Wai Yee?
Okay, so I think besides being open-minded and ready to adjust certain expectations, what human resource experts say is communication is key right now between employers and employees. So because things are changing so rapidly all the time, it's really important to keep employees informed of any plans or changes that you plan. So for example, I think there's some employees who are not used to working from home and they feel cooped up or maybe not productive. I think it's a good time to remind them that unless you're under quarantine orders, working from home means that you still can step out and just practice good hygiene and kind of gather your energy again outside and then come back and get back to work.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Wai Yee, for shedding more light on the situation. That was Correspondent Yip Wai Yee, and you can visit straitstimes.com to read her piece on BCPs and the costs that businesses are bearing. And those are our top stories for today. Keep up to date with news in Singapore and around the world at straitstimes.com. I'm Olivia Quay. See you tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.